Tell them what my daddy did. The words sliced through the 42nd floor conference room so sharply that even the city noise beyond the glass walls seemed to disappear. Emily Mercer stood barefoot on the polished oak table, her small chest rising unevenly as she clutched a jagged piece of broken mirror in trembling fingers. 12 lawyers sat frozen around her, their expensive suits stiff with panic, legal pads abandoned, voices gone silent. At the far end of the room, Jonathan Mercer, CEO of Mercer Global Holdings, looked nothing like the man Forbes magazine once called the most untouchable attorney in New York. His face had gone pale beneath the white office lights. "Emily," he said carefully, his voice lower than anyone in the room had ever heard it. "Sweetheart, put that down." But the little girl shook her head violently. Tears streaked her cheeks. "You lied," she whispered. "You all lied." No one moved. Not the lawyers. Not the assistants standing near the espresso station. Not the security guards outside the glass doors pretending not to stare. Earlier that morning, 3 child psychologists had failed to calm her. 2 behavioral specialists had walked out exhausted. 1 attorney had suggested sedation. Another quietly recommended a private facility in Connecticut. Jonathan had approved all of it without blinking. Because Jonathan Mercer solved every problem the same way. With money. With contracts. With control. But none of it worked on his daughter anymore. Emily's breathing became uneven again, tiny gasps filling the cold room. The shard in her hand shook harder. Jonathan took 1 cautious step forward. "Emily, please. Don't," she screamed, and the sound bounced violently against the marble walls. Several lawyers flinched. 1 woman near the end of the table quietly started crying. Then another voice entered the room. Soft, calm, uninvited. "She's not afraid of the truth." Everyone turned at once. Near the doorway stood a black woman in a gray housekeeping uniform, one hand resting on the handle of a janitor's cart. Maya Williams had only come upstairs to replace the trash liners and wipe fingerprints from the windows before the board meeting began. She wasn't supposed to speak. Wasn't supposed to look directly at executives. Certainly wasn't supposed to interrupt a crisis involving the most powerful man in the building. Yet somehow, her voice carried through the room more steadily than anyone else's. "She's afraid nobody told her the truth sooner." Jonathan's eyes narrowed instantly. "Who let her in here?" he snapped, the authority returning to his tone like muscle memory. But Maya didn't answer him. Her eyes stayed on Emily, not on the broken glass, not on the terrified executives. Just the little girl standing alone in the center of a room full of adults who had spent months talking around her instead of to her. Maya stepped forward slowly, her rubber-soled shoes barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. "I'm not going to come close unless you want me to," she said gently. Emily's fingers tightened around the mirror piece, but she didn't scream this time. She only stared. Maya noticed the dark circles under the girl's eyes, the oversized sweater hanging off one shoulder, the exhaustion hidden beneath the fear. She had seen that kind of look before. Years ago. In another small face she still carried in her memory every single day. "Did somebody lie to you?" Maya asked softly. "Or did they lie about someone you loved?" The room went still. Completely still. Emily's lips parted. Her breathing slowed. And for the first time all morning, the piece of broken glass lowered half an inch. Jonathan Mercer felt every pair of eyes in the conference room shift toward him at once. Not because he was the billionaire owner of the building. Not because judges and senators returned his phone calls within minutes, but because for the first time in years, he looked uncertain. Emily stood frozen on the conference table, the broken mirror now hanging loosely from her fingertips as she stared at Maya Williams like she had recognized something the adults around her had missed for months. The overhead lights reflected softly against the glass walls, turning the room cold and pale. Somewhere below them, Manhattan traffic rolled through the rain-soaked streets, distant and muffled 40 stories beneath the tower. Jonathan swallowed hard. "Security," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off Maya. "Escort her out." But nobody moved. Even the guards near the door hesitated. Because Emily suddenly spoke again. "No." Her voice cracked from exhaustion, but it carried through the silence like a pulled thread. She stepped carefully off the table, still barefoot, still trembling. "She stays." Jonathan blinked. That alone felt impossible. His daughter had barely spoken 10 full sentences in the last 3 months. After Victoria Mercer died, Emily stopped talking to almost everyone. Teachers, Doctors, friends, lawyers, especially lawyers. The moment she saw dark suits or heard legal terms, panic flooded her eyes like a storm rolling in across water. Jonathan had tried everything. The best therapists in Boston, specialists in Chicago, private consultants flown in from Los Angeles. Nothing reached her. Nothing quieted the fear sitting behind her eyes. But now this woman with a housekeeping badge somehow had. Maya remained where she stood beside the janitor cart, posture calm, hands visible, voice steady. She did not approach Emily again. She simply waited. Jonathan noticed that immediately. Every professional he hired always pushed, asked questions too quickly, moved too close, treated Emily like a problem that needed solving before the next appointment ended. Maya did not do any of that. She just saw the child standing in front of her. One of the attorneys cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Mercer, perhaps we should continue this discussion privately." Jonathan ignored him. His attention stayed locked on Maya now. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked. Maya finally looked at him directly. Her dark eyes were calm, but there was something unshakable underneath them. Not anger, not fear, recognition. "I think your daughter heard something she was never supposed to carry alone," she said softly. Jonathan's jaw tightened instantly. "You do not know anything about my family." Maya nodded once. "You are right, sir. I do not." Her voice stayed respectful, but she did not lower her eyes. "But I know what children look like when adults bury pain under silence." The words landed harder than Jonathan expected. Emily slowly walked toward Maya now, small fingers clutching the sleeve of her oversized sweater. The little girl's breathing had steadied almost completely. One of the lawyers whispered under his breath, stunned. Jonathan heard it clearly. "How is she doing that?" Maya lowered herself carefully onto one knee, so she was eye level with Emily. "Nobody told you the truth, did they?" she asked gently. Emily's eyes immediately filled with tears again. The room seemed to tighten around Jonathan's chest. Because deep down, somewhere beneath the contracts and investigations and carefully managed press conferences, he already knew exactly what truth the little girl was afraid of. The silence inside the conference room felt heavier now, almost visible beneath the white lights and towering windows. Emily stood only inches away from Maya Williams, her small shoulders trembling beneath the oversized gray sweater she had refused to take off since her mother's funeral. The broken piece of mirror slipped gently from her fingers onto the polished table with a soft clink that made several attorneys exhale at once. Jonathan Mercer noticed it immediately. The danger had passed, yet somehow the room felt even more fragile than before. Maya did not celebrate, did not smile. She simply stayed kneeling at eye level with the little girl as though the rest of the room no longer existed. "You do not have to say anything right now," she whispered gently. Emily stared at her for several long seconds before speaking so quietly that only the nearest people could hear. "Mom said lawyers hide things." A visible tension moved across the conference table. One attorney lowered his eyes instantly. Another shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. Jonathan's face hardened. "Emily," he said carefully, "that is enough." But the little girl flinched at the sound of his voice. Maya noticed it immediately. So did Jonathan. And for the first time in months, something colder than frustration settled into his chest. Guilt. Maya slowly stood back up, keeping her movements calm and predictable. "Sir," she said softly toward Jonathan, "she is terrified." "I can see that," he answered. Sharply. "No, sir," Maya replied. "You can see the panic. That is different." The words hit harder than Jonathan expected. Rain slid slowly down the massive windows behind him, blurring the Manhattan skyline into streaks of silver and gray. Somewhere far below, ambulance sirens echoed faintly through the streets. Inside the room, nobody spoke. Jonathan looked at his daughter again. Emily had not looked directly at him once since entering the conference room nearly 40 minutes earlier. But she kept looking at Maya, like she felt safe there. Jonathan hated how much that realization unsettled him. One of the senior attorneys finally stood. "Mr. Mercer, perhaps Miss Mercer should rest upstairs while we continue the board discussion privately." Emily immediately shook her head. "No more lawyers." Her voice cracked again. "Please." Maya's eyes softened. "Did something happen the night your mother died?" she asked gently. Jonathan's expression changed instantly. "That is enough," he snapped. The room tightened all over again. Maya looked toward him calmly. "I am not trying to disrespect you, sir." "Then stop questioning my daughter." I think she has been questioning herself alone for too long. Jonathan stepped forward now, expensive Italian shoes striking sharply against the hardwood floor. You are a housekeeper, he said coldly. You do not know what this family has survived. Maya went still for a moment. Not offended, not intimidated, just still. Then she glanced toward the gold wedding portrait hanging near the conference room entrance. Victoria Mercer smiled brightly in the photograph beside her husband, elegant and radiant beneath ballroom lights that no longer existed. Maya looked back at Jonathan quietly. No, sir, she said. But I know what happens to children when grief turns into silence. Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but Emily suddenly grabbed Maya's hand. It happened so quickly that everyone froze again. The little girl's fingers tightened desperately around Maya's sleeve. Do not make her leave, Emily whispered. Her voice sounded smaller now. Fragile. Human. Jonathan stared at his daughter in disbelief because she had not willingly touched another person since her mother died 6 months earlier. Jonathan Mercer could not stop staring at his daughter's hand wrapped tightly around Maya Williams's sleeve. The sight unsettled him more than the shattered mirror or the panic attack or the whispers circling the conference room. Emily had spent 6 months avoiding touch like it burned her. Nurses could not comfort her. Therapists could not reach her. Even Jonathan himself had learned to keep distance after too many moments watching his daughter recoil from him with frightened eyes. Yet now she stood beside a woman she had met less than 10 minutes ago, as though something inside her finally felt safe enough to breathe. Rain tapped softly against the towering glass walls while the city lights flickered pale silver across the room. Maya looked down at Emily gently. You are okay, she whispered. Nobody here is going to force you to talk. Emily swallowed hard. Her fingers tightened again. Jonathan noticed every detail. The trembling in her shoulders had eased. Her breathing no longer came in sharp bursts. Even her eyes looked different now. Still sad, still exhausted, but no longer trapped in panic. One of the attorneys stepped closer carefully. Mr. Mercer, he murmured. The board members are waiting downstairs. Jonathan barely heard him. His attention stayed fixed on Maya. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance. Gray housekeeping uniform, comfortable shoes, hair pulled neatly back, no expensive degree hanging on a wall, no medical title. Yet somehow she had accomplished what entire teams of specialists could not. Jonathan hated how much that fact irritated him, because it forced him to confront something he had avoided for months. Maybe this was never about expertise. Maybe nobody had truly listened to Emily at all. Maya slowly crouched again beside the little girl. Can I ask you something? Emily nodded faintly. Maya's voice softened even more. When people mention your mother, do they tell you what happened, or do they tell you to move on? The question landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Emily's eyes immediately filled with tears again. Jonathan felt tension tighten across his chest. Maya, he warned quietly. But Emily spoke before anyone else could. Everybody says she had an accident. Her voice shook, but I heard them fighting. The room went completely still again. One of the attorneys lowered his gaze toward the floor. Another quietly closed a folder sitting open on the conference table. Jonathan's face hardened instantly. Emily, he said carefully, your mother and I argued sometimes. That is normal. No, Emily shook her head harder now. She was crying. Jonathan felt heat rise beneath his collar. Maya did not interrupt, did not rush the child. She simply stayed present, calm, patient, like someone sitting beside a frightened animal waiting for it to trust the silence. Emily looked up at Maya with watery eyes. Mom said some people were hiding bad things. Jonathan's voice turned colder. That is enough for today. Maya slowly stood. Sir, she said quietly, she is carrying fear that does not belong to a child. Jonathan exhaled sharply. And what exactly qualifies you to make that judgment? The question hung sharp in the air. Several people glanced nervously toward Maya, expecting embarrassment or apology. Instead, her expression only grew sadder. Because I carried it too, she answered softly. Jonathan frowned. Maya hesitated for the first time since entering the room. Her fingers brushed unconsciously against the thin silver chain resting near her collarbone. Years ago, she continued quietly, my little girl overheard adults lying about why her father disappeared from our lives. Everyone thought protecting her from the truth would make things easier. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the rain-covered windows. It did not. The room felt smaller suddenly. Heavier. Emily stared up at her. What happened? She whispered. Maya swallowed once before answering. She stopped trusting everyone. Jonathan noticed something in Maya's eyes then. Not performance. Not manipulation. Grief. Old grief. The kind that settles deep and stays there. Jonathan Mercer had spent his entire life learning how to control a room. Courtrooms. Boardrooms. Political dinners in Washington. Billion-dollar negotiations in Dubai. One look from him usually ended arguments before they began. But standing there beneath the cold white conference lights while rain crawled down the windows behind him, he realized he had completely lost control of this one. Emily still stood beside Maya Williams like she was afraid the woman might disappear if she let go. The little girl's fingers clung tightly to the sleeve of the gray housekeeping uniform while the attorneys around the table exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody seemed to know what to do anymore. Maya's quiet confession lingered heavily in the air. Old grief. A lost daughter. Silence that poisoned trust. Jonathan hated how personal the room suddenly felt. This meeting is over, he said firmly. Several lawyers immediately began gathering folders and tablets, relieved to escape the tension hanging in the room. But before anyone reached the doors, Emily suddenly spoke again. Dad. Jonathan stopped instantly. His daughter had not called him that in weeks. Usually it was nothing at all, or cold silence. Sometimes she refused to look at him for entire days. Now her voice sounded small and frightened beneath the steady hum of the air conditioning. Did Mom find something bad? Jonathan felt every eye return to him again. The question struck with terrifying precision because it touched the exact place he had spent months trying not to think about. Victoria Mercer had been many things. Elegant, brilliant, compassionate in ways Jonathan never fully understood. But she had also been stubborn, especially during the final months before her death. She questioned deals, asked difficult questions during meetings, challenged legal settlements Jonathan preferred to bury quietly behind non-disclosure agreements and corporate restructuring. At first he thought it was grief after losing her own father. Then came the arguments. Long nights behind closed office doors. Voices low but sharp enough that Emily must have heard more than they realized. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Your mother was under a lot of stress, he answered carefully. Emily shook her head immediately. She said people were lying. The room froze again. Maya remained silent beside her, but Jonathan noticed the way she gently squeezed the little girl's hand once. Not controlling. Grounding. Emily's eyes filled again. The night before she died, she told me if anything happened to her, I should never believe people just because they wear suits. One of the attorneys near the far end of the table suddenly looked away so quickly it did not escape Jonathan's notice. A cold sensation crept slowly through his chest. Maya's voice remained soft. Children remember more than adults think they do. Jonathan turned sharply toward her. You are crossing a line. The words came out harder than he intended. Emily flinched instantly beside Maya. The reaction hit Jonathan like a punch beneath the ribs. Maya lowered her eyes briefly. Not submissive. Just sad. I am sorry, sir, she said quietly. But your daughter does not need another person telling her what to forget. Jonathan rubbed a trembling hand across his face. Exhaustion settled into him all at once. Months of investigations. Funeral interviews. Press conferences. Sleepless nights inside a mansion that no longer felt like home. And through all of it, he kept treating Emily's fear like a problem to contain instead of pain to understand. The realization sickened him. Then Emily whispered something so softly Jonathan almost missed it. I heard Mom crying in your office. Silence swallowed the room whole. Jonathan's breathing slowed painfully, because suddenly he remembered that night with horrifying clarity. Victoria standing near the window in tears, a red folder in her hands, rain against the glass, her voice shaking as she accused Mercer Global of hiding evidence tied to a wrongful death settlement. And Emily had been upstairs the entire time. The room was quiet now except for the soft patter of rain against the tall windows, streaks of silver light bouncing across the polished conference table. Emily Mercer sat cross-legged on the edge of the table, small hands clasped tightly in her lap, still trembling slightly, but no longer panicked. Maya Williams remained kneeling beside her, calm, observing every subtle shift in the little girl's expression. Jonathan Mercer leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping slowly on the armrest. Jaw tight. He had never realized how much a child could carry inside in silence, and how little adults actually saw. The walls of the room, lined with awards and certificates, seemed to close in, reflecting his unease back at him. Maya tilted her head gently, letting Emily take the lead in conversation. "Do you remember what happened the night your mother was upset?" she asked softly. Emily nodded, a single tear rolling down her cheek. "She was so sad, and everyone said she was being dramatic. I knew she was crying for something real." Jonathan's throat tightened. The truth was searing and undeniable, and for the first time he felt the weight of having hidden it, having relied on silence and control to manage pain that should have been shared. Maya's voice was steady, soothing, not commanding. She needed someone to hear her. Someone who did not run or argue or try to fix it immediately. Someone who simply listened. Emily blinked, the storm inside her quieting further. The attorneys, unsure of how to react, watched the scene with a kind of awe, their professional detachment meaningless in the face of a child finding a measure of peace. Jonathan noticed the subtle relaxation in his daughter's posture, the way her fingers slowly unclenched, the small breaths escaping her mouth in longer, more even intervals. The contrast was stark. Months of specialists, consultants, and therapy had not produced this calm. Yet here, a housekeeper had done it with patience, presence, and unwavering empathy. Outside the window, city lights flickered through the rain, distant horns faint, creating a cocoon of quiet around them. Jonathan looked at Maya again, not as a housekeeper, not as someone of lesser status, but as a person who had broken through walls he himself had not known existed. Emily's voice came softly, almost a whisper. "I feel like someone is finally listening to me." And in that moment, Jonathan felt a subtle shift, the first tremor of understanding. Maya smiled faintly, never moving too quickly, letting Emily's newfound trust settle in, letting the stillness hold its weight. The room no longer felt like a battlefield, nor like a place of authority, but a small universe defined by empathy, presence, and the unspoken acknowledgement that truth, gently spoken and attentively received, could heal more than any lecture, any order, any law ever could. Rain slid slowly down the glass, reflecting the faint glow from the skyline behind them. The tension that had gripped the room dissipated into quiet understanding. Jonathan exhaled slowly, realizing that in the absence of fear and in the presence of genuine listening, a child's heart could find a kind of peace even amidst shadows of loss, and that perhaps, for the first time in months, his daughter had begun to feel safe again. Jonathan Mercer finally lowered himself into the high-backed leather chair at the end of the conference table, his hands clasped tightly, fingers interlacing as though trying to hold himself together. For the first time, he realized that all of his wealth, all of his power, and all of the carefully constructed authority in the world could not create the connection that his daughter so desperately needed. Emily sat beside Maya, her small body relaxed but her eyes alert, studying every subtle expression on Maya's face. Maya, with patience born of her own experience and quiet resilience, simply nodded, acknowledging the fear and grief that had accumulated in Emily's heart. Jonathan watched as the realization settled in. The room around them faded into the background, the polished floors and glass walls reflecting light but not meaning, while the truth of what had occurred inside this quiet moment began to crystallize in his mind. His daughter's distress had been neither random nor unfounded. It had been carefully constructed by silence, by words withheld, by fear of confronting painful truths, and by his own unintentional absence in her emotional life. And now, for the first time, a small, steadfast presence had broken through. Maya's gentle voice spoke again, soft but steady. "She needs to see that truth can be safe," she said. Emily tilted her head slightly, the first hint of a smile flickering as she processed the words and the intent behind them. Jonathan's chest tightened. He understood immediately that the true lesson had not been delivered by law, by authority, or by coercion. It had been delivered through empathy, presence, and patience, the kind that cannot be bought or commanded. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, watching Maya and Emily interact, noticing the subtle ways in which Emily's body had shifted from tension to a cautious trust, the tiny adjustments of her hands, the softening of her shoulders, the light in her eyes returning just enough to recognize hope. The city lights beyond the glass walls shimmered in the evening rain, casting reflections that danced across the conference room like distant stars. Jonathan realized that he had been observing this change quietly, without interfering, because he understood at last that his role was not to control or dictate, but to witness, to support, and to let the truth heal. Emily whispered a single word, almost too quiet to hear. "Thank you." And her voice carried the weight of months of unspoken fear and unprocessed grief. Jonathan's throat tightened with emotion he had long suppressed. He felt the subtle, yet undeniable shift of his daughter's trust forming in that room. Maya did not respond with fanfare or explanation. She only allowed the quiet to stretch, creating a space where healing could occur. The tension that had gripped Jonathan's chest for months slowly began to dissolve, replaced by a deep awareness of responsibility, of the importance of presence, and the fragile power of truth delivered with care. Outside, the rain continued to fall, soft and steady, as though the world itself were witnessing the small, monumental change that had just occurred inside. Jonathan realized that this moment would forever alter the way he approached his daughter, his family, and perhaps even himself. Emily rested her head slightly against Maya's arm, letting herself be comforted in a way she had never permitted before, and Jonathan sat silently, absorbing the gravity of what he had just witnessed, understanding fully for the first time the quiet strength that had bridged months of fear and grief, and knowing that everything in the room had shifted irreversibly toward truth and trust. Jonathan Mercer rose slowly from the leather chair, his eyes still fixed on Emily. And Maya, as if trying to memorize the subtle shifts in expression that had unfolded over the past hour. The room felt impossibly quiet, every sound amplified. The soft hum of the air conditioning, the distant patter of rain against the glass, the muted clatter of papers that had been left scattered on the polished conference table. Emily shifted slightly, leaning into Maya just enough to feel supported without being restrained, and Jonathan realized for the first time that his daughter had willingly sought comfort from someone outside of him, someone who had no authority, no power, no stake in the company, only the steady presence of empathy. Maya's dark eyes met Jonathan's briefly, and he caught the depth of understanding there, that she knew grief intimately, that she had carried it alone, and that she understood how fragile trust could be in a child's heart. He took a slow breath, letting the tension in his shoulders ease fractionally, and walked to the window, staring down at the streets far below, slick with rain and flickering with headlights. For a moment he allowed himself to feel the weight of all the missteps, all the silence, the choices he had made thinking they were protective, but which had only built walls between him and his daughter. Maya remained kneeling beside Emily, calm, patient, allowing the little girl to process her emotions at her own pace. Jonathan noticed the small smile that began to tug at the corner of Emily's lips, subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The realization struck him harder than any boardroom defeat or legal loss. Presence and truth could achieve what all of his power and influence could not. He felt the layers of control and ego fall away, leaving only the raw human connection that had been missing for months. The attorneys quietly began gathering their things, leaving the room in a respectful silence, sensing that this was not a moment for interruption or commentary. Jonathan turned slowly back toward Emily and Maya, his expression softer now, lined with both regret and awe. He took a step closer and lowered his voice, careful not to startle his daughter. "I will do better," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, acknowledging the gap that had existed and the responsibility he now understood he carried. Emily blinked, looking up at him briefly before returning her gaze to Maya, the bond between them palpable in the small, measured movements of her body. Maya's gentle guidance and steadfast presence had done what no one else could, allowed a child to find her voice, her trust, and the beginnings of peace. Jonathan realized that the role of a father, of anyone in a position of influence, was not always to control, but sometimes to witness, to learn, and to support without imposing. The rain outside slowed to a drizzle, and the city's lights shimmered in the fading evening, reflecting off the glass walls and casting long, gentle streaks across the room. In that quiet, liminal space, Jonathan felt the first stirrings of hope for Emily, the faint but undeniable sense that healing had begun, that truth, when delivered with patience and compassion, could restore the bonds that silence had broken, and that perhaps, for the first time in months, his daughter felt seen, heard, and safe. The morning light filtered softly through the tall windows of the Mercer penthouse, casting long, warm streaks across the hardwood floors and the polished glass surfaces of the conference room that had witnessed so much tension the night before. Emily Mercer sat quietly on a plush gray armchair, small hands folded gently in her lap, eyes scanning the room with a calmness Jonathan had not seen for months. Maya Williams stood nearby, her presence steady, her posture unassuming yet commanding in its quiet authority, as if her very stillness offered Emily permission to breathe fully for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Jonathan lingered by the window, watching his daughter with a mixture of awe and humility, realizing how much he had underestimated the power of patient empathy and listening without judgment. The city below glimmered faintly through the rain-dampened streets, the distant hum of traffic like a soft heartbeat accompanying the new rhythm settling into the Mercer home. Emily finally shifted, leaning slightly forward as if testing the safety of her surroundings, and Jonathan felt a stirring of hope he had long feared lost. He took a cautious step toward his daughter, letting his presence be gentle, unthreatening, waiting for the quiet permission that Maya's guidance had instilled. Emily lifted her gaze toward him, her eyes holding a fragile light that spoke of trust beginning to return. Jonathan exhaled slowly, a tension he had carried for months releasing in a single, quiet breath. Maya watched with subtle satisfaction, knowing that her role was complete, that she had helped create the bridge over the silence and fear that had separated father and daughter for far too long. The room remained silent, not awkwardly, but with a weightless calm that allowed each person to exist fully in the moment. Jonathan sat down on the low sofa across from Emily, maintaining a respectful distance, his eyes soft and attentive. He did not speak immediately, allowing the child to set the pace of their interaction, recognizing that healing cannot be rushed. Emily reached for a small sketchbook that lay on the arm of the chair, flipping it open to reveal drawings of the family, simple and heartfelt, a depiction of moments she had longed to share but lacked the courage to express. She showed the images to Jonathan, who leaned in to observe quietly, feeling the sincerity and emotion conveyed in every line and color. The room's light caught on the edges of the sketchbook, reflecting a gentle glow across their faces. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist, leaving a fresh clarity in the streets and a subtle sparkle on the windows. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "I see you, Emily.